The Valiant drifted through the void like a wounded animal searching for shelter. Its hull bore the scars of 100 battles. Metal twisted and burned where enemy fire had struck true. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the command console as he stared at the tactical display. Every red dot on that screen represented a Krath warship, and there were too many to count. His crew had been fighting for 3 days straight without rest, and exhaustion lined every face around him. Lieutenant Sophie Blake sat at the tactical station, her fingers dancing across holographic controls as she tried to find them a way out. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her uniform was stained with coolant from a ruptured pipe she had helped repair hours ago. She looked up at Jake with tired eyes and shook her head. There was no escape route, not this time. The Krath had them surrounded, and their weapons were nearly depleted. Commander Pete Harris appeared on the internal comm screen, his face streaked with grease and sweat. The engineering deck behind him was a chaos of sparks and emergency lighting. He reported that the main reactor was failing, and they had maybe one more jump left in the engines before everything shut down permanently. Jake nodded and closed the channel, his mind racing through impossible calculations. They needed a miracle, but humanity had run out of those weeks ago when New Terra fell. The comm system crackled to life with a priority message. Jake activated it, expecting another distress call from survivors they couldn't save. Instead, he heard static-filled silence followed by automated coordinates. The signal was old, incredibly old, using encryption protocols that predated the modern fleet by centuries. Sophie ran the coordinates through their navigation computer and frowned. The location was listed as Sanctuary 9, a failed colony attempt from over 600 years ago. The system was marked as dead space, worthless and forgotten. Jake made his decision in seconds. He ordered Pete to prepare the jump drive for one final transition. Sophie protested, saying they had no idea what waited at those coordinates, but Jake cut her off. They had no other choice. The Krath would destroy them in minutes if they stayed, and at least this way they had a chance. Pete confirmed the jump calculations were loaded, and Jake gave the order. The Valiant shuddered as its failing engines tore a hole in space and reality twisted around them. The transition felt wrong. Jump travel was never comfortable, but this was different. The ship groaned and buckled under forces it wasn't designed to handle. Crew members grabbed onto anything solid as the deck tilted violently. Alarms screamed throughout every corridor, and Jake heard Pete shouting orders to his engineering teams over the noise. Then suddenly everything went quiet. The Valiant emerged into normal space, and the view screen showed them something impossible. They had arrived in a system that shouldn't exist. A massive structure orbited a dead gray moon, its surface covered in solar collectors and communication arrays that still glowed with power. The design was human, unmistakably so, but unlike anything in current service. Sophie scanned the structure and gasped. It was broadcasting a human identification signal on military frequencies that hadn't been used in over half a millennium. The signal identified itself as Project Lazarus Priority Clearance Level 10. Jake had never heard of anything with a clearance that high. Pete managed to coax the engines into one final maneuver, bringing them alongside the structure. Docking clamps engaged automatically, responding to the Valiant's transponder codes as if the facility had been waiting for them. Jake ordered a security team assembled, while Sophie pulled up everything she could find about Project Lazarus. The database had almost nothing, just fragments of classified files that had been buried so deep they might as well have been deleted. What little she found mentioned something about advanced military research and the First Contact Wars, a conflict most people barely remembered. Jake led the team through the airlock, his sidearm drawn and ready. The facility's atmosphere was breathable, kept fresh by systems that had run automatically for centuries. The corridors were wide and lit by emergency lighting that activated as they passed. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the technology looked functional. They moved deeper into the structure, following signs that pointed toward something called the Lazarus Chamber. Sophie stayed close to Jake, her scanner tracking power signatures throughout the facility. She detected a massive energy source at the center, something generating enough power to run a small city. Pete examined the walls and ceiling, marveling at construction techniques he didn't recognize. The materials were some kind of advanced composite that seemed stronger than modern hull plating. Whoever built this place had access to technology that humanity had either lost or never shared with the general public. They reached a blast door marked with biohazard symbols and military warnings. The door recognized Jake's command codes and opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Beyond was a chamber so large it could have held 3 starships. Rows of cryopods lined the walls, hundreds of them, each one displaying a green status light. Jake approached the nearest pod and wiped away the frost covering its viewport. Inside was a person, a woman, suspended in stasis. Her features were sharp and strong, and even in sleep she looked dangerous. Sophie accessed the facility's main computer and found files that made her blood run cold. Project Lazarus had been humanity's most classified military program, created during the First Contact Wars when an alien species called the Vryn had nearly wiped out every human colony. Conventional soldiers couldn't compete with Vryn warriors, so humanity had done the unthinkable. They had created super soldiers, men and women genetically modified to be faster, stronger, and smarter than any normal human. 200 of them had been created, and they had won the war. But after the victory, the politicians and military leaders had been horrified by what they had made. These super soldiers were too powerful, too dangerous to be allowed freedom in peacetime. So they had been placed here in cryostasis, locked away and forgotten. The files listed their commander as Lynn Carter, a tactical genius who had orchestrated the final battle that broke the Vryn offensive. Her second was Danny Shaw, a man whose combat record was so violent it had been partially redacted even in these classified files. Jake stared at the pods and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. These soldiers had been created to save humanity once before, and now humanity needed saving again. But they had been locked away for good reason, and waking them might unleash something humanity couldn't control. Pete pointed out that they didn't have much choice. The Valiant was dying, they had no fleet to return to, and the Krath would eventually find this place. They needed help, even if that help came from humanity's darkest secret. Sophie found the awakening protocol in the system files. It required command authorization, which Jake could provide. The process would take several hours to complete safely, bringing the soldiers out of stasis gradually to prevent cellular damage. Jake looked at his crew, saw their exhausted faces and desperate eyes, and made his choice. He entered his authorization codes and initiated the sequence. The cryopods hummed to life and lights began changing from green to amber as ancient systems engaged. Deep within the pods, the super soldiers began to wake after 6 centuries of dreamless sleep, and Jake wondered if he had just saved humanity or doomed what little remained of it. The first pod opened with a sound like breaking ice. White vapor poured out across the floor as the cryogel drained away through reclamation ports. The woman inside gasped and her eyes snapped open, pupils contracting as they adjusted to light after centuries of darkness. Lynn Carter pulled herself up with movements that seemed too fast, too precise, like a machine coming online. Her gaze swept across the chamber, cataloging every detail, every person, every potential threat. When her eyes locked onto Jake, he felt like he was being analyzed by something beyond human. Jake introduced himself and tried to explain the situation, but Lynn held up a hand to stop him. Her voice was rough from disuse but carried absolute authority when she spoke. She asked for a status report on Project Lazarus, the facility systems, and the current political situation. Jake glanced at Sophie, who pulled up the data on a portable terminal. Lynn took the device and scrolled through 600 years of history in minutes, her enhanced mind processing information faster than anyone Jake had ever seen. Her expression never changed as she read about the fall of Earth, the destruction of the colonies, and the extinction of humanity. More pods were opening now. Men and women emerged from stasis, each one moving with that same unsettling speed and precision. They gathered around Lynn without being called, forming into organized groups automatically. Danny Shaw was among the first fully awake, a tall man with gray eyes that seemed to see everything. He stood at Lynn's shoulder and read the data over her arm, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the terrible news. Other soldiers checked their equipment lockers, pulling out weapons and armor that looked ancient but well-maintained. Lynn finally looked up from the terminal and studied Jake's crew. She asked how many humans were left, and the question hung in the air like a blade. Sophie answered quietly that as far as they knew, the Valiant's crew of 42 people might be the last living humans in the galaxy. There could be other survivors hiding in deep space or on remote stations, but every major population center was gone. The Krath Empire had been thorough in their extermination campaign. Lynn's expression didn't change, but something dark and cold flickered in her eyes. Danny stepped forward and asked Jake about the Krath fleet's strength and disposition. Pete pulled up tactical data, showing the estimated number of Krath warships and their control over former human territory. Danny studied the information with a professional detachment that made Jake uncomfortable. These super soldiers were looking at the extinction of their species with the same calm they might give to a training exercise. But then Danny spoke, and Jake heard something underneath that calm. It was rage, cold and controlled, waiting to be unleashed. The other super soldiers gathered closer as Lynn addressed them. Her voice carried through the chamber without effort, reaching every ear. She told them they had been awakened because humanity faced extinction, just as it had during the first contact wars. They had been created to protect their species, and that purpose remained unchanged. The fact that 600 years had passed, that the politicians who imprisoned them were long dead, none of that mattered. They were soldiers, and soldiers had a duty. If humanity existed anywhere in the galaxy, even just 42 people on a dying ship, then they would fight to protect it. Jake watched the super soldiers respond to Lynn's words. There was no cheering, no dramatic declarations. They simply nodded and began moving with clear purpose. Some headed to the armory sections, others to the facility's command center, and several groups moved toward the lower bays where Pete had detected large power signatures. These warriors operated with a cohesion that seemed almost telepathic, understanding their roles without needing orders. It was both impressive and frightening to witness. Sophie followed Lynn as the commander moved through the facility, asking questions about the modifications that had been done to them. Lynn answered honestly. The genetic enhancements affected every system in their bodies. Their muscles were denser and stronger, their bones reinforced with mineral compounds, their nervous systems altered to process information and react faster than baseline humans. They could survive in hard vacuum for up to 15 minutes. Their blood carried more oxygen, and their healing capabilities were remarkable. But there were costs. Lynn explained that the modifications came with side effects the original scientists couldn't eliminate. The super soldiers experienced occasional sensory overload when too much information came in at once. Their emotional responses were dampened, not absent but muted, making it difficult to form the kinds of bonds that normal humans took for granted. They were aware always that they had been made into something other than human, and that awareness created a distance between them and the people they were designed to protect. Some soldiers had struggled with that distance, questioning their place in a society that feared them. Pete found himself working alongside two super soldiers named Carl Jensen and Marie Lopez in the facility's engineering section. They showed him technology that made his head spin. The facility contained prototype ships, advanced weapons, and manufacturing systems that could produce materials humanity thought were impossible. Carl explained that Project Lazarus had been given unlimited resources during the war, and the scientists here had made breakthroughs that were never shared with the general public. When peace came, everything had been buried along with the soldiers. Marie powered up a holographic display showing 3 massive warships in the lower bays. They were unlike any human design Pete had seen, built with sweeping curves and integrated weapon systems that looked organic. She explained these ships had been designed specifically for super soldier crews, with manual controls that required enhanced reflexes to operate effectively. The ships were named Requiem, Dirge, and Aftermath. They had never been commissioned, never even flown outside the facility. But they were functional, and with some work they could be made ready for combat. Jake found Danny in one of the training rooms, moving through combat drills with fluid grace. He asked the soldier what they planned to do now that they were awake. Danny stopped mid-movement and turned to face him. He said the plan was simple. They would fight the Krath until either the enemy was destroyed or the last super soldier fell. Jake pointed out that 200 soldiers couldn't defeat an empire that had crushed humanity's entire military. Danny smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. He said 200 super soldiers had once defeated an alien species that was more advanced and more numerous than humanity. They had done the impossible before, and they would do it again. Lynn called a meeting in the command center, gathering both Jake's crew and her soldiers. She laid out the tactical situation with brutal honesty. The Krath thought humanity was extinct, which gave them one advantage: surprise. The enemy would be expecting scattered survivors at best, not organized military resistance. Lin proposed a guerrilla campaign, hitting supply lines and command posts, making the Krath bleed for every system they occupied. It would be dangerous, probably suicidal, but it would prove that humanity still had fight left. Jake listened to the plan and felt hope stirring for the first time in weeks. Lin wasn't just talking about survival, she was talking about revenge. The super soldiers had weapons and skills that the Krath had never encountered. They could strike from the shadows, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy could respond. It wouldn't win the war, not immediately, but it would buy time and maybe inspire other survivors to join the fight. Sophie added that if they could capture Krath communication equipment, they could start broadcasting messages to any humans still in hiding. The meeting concluded with assignments. Lin's soldiers would spend the next few days familiarizing themselves with current technology and preparing the prototype ships for combat. Pete would work with the facility engineers to arm the Valiant with some of the advanced weapons stored here. Sophie would set up a communication network to scan for human survivors and monitor Krath fleet movements. Jake would coordinate everything, acting as the bridge between the modern crew and the ancient warriors. As everyone dispersed to their tasks, Jake stood with Lin in the empty command center. He asked her if she really thought they could win. Lin looked at him with those intense eyes and said winning wasn't certain, but neither was losing. The Krath had made a mistake by thinking humanity was finished. They had forgotten that humans were survivors, fighters who refused to quit even when the odds were impossible. The super soldiers had been created in humanity's darkest hour, and they had turned the tide once before. They would do everything in their power to do it again. Jake watched Lin walk away and felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. The Valiant might be dying and humanity might be scattered, but they weren't alone anymore. 200 warriors from another age had joined their cause, bringing with them skills and technology that could change everything. The war wasn't over, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to write a different ending to humanity's story. The days following the awakening blurred together in a frenzy of preparation and discovery. The super soldiers adapted to their new reality with a speed that amazed Jake's crew, learning about 6 centuries of technological advancement in hours rather than weeks. But adaptation went both ways, and Jake found himself learning just how different these warriors truly were. He watched Danny spar with 3 other soldiers in the training bay, their movements almost too fast to follow. What looked like a brutal fight was actually a carefully controlled exercise, each strike and block calculated to test reflexes without causing injury. When they finished, none of them were even breathing hard. Sophie spent time with Lin in the command center, helping her understand modern fleet tactics and communication protocols. She noticed things about the commander that were both impressive and unsettling. Lin could watch 6 different tactical displays simultaneously and track every detail on each one. Her mind worked through strategic problems at a pace that made military AI look slow. But when Sophie asked her about personal things, about what it felt like to wake up after 600 years, Lin's answers were distant and mechanical. The emotional dampening that came with her enhancements made it difficult for her to process feelings the way normal people did. Pete found himself fascinated by the technology hidden in Project Lazarus. Carl and Marie showed him weapons that fired compressed plasma, armor that could harden on impact to deflect energy weapons, and propulsion systems that bent the rules of physics in ways he didn't fully understand. The scientists who built this facility had been decades ahead of their time, maybe centuries. Carl explained that military necessity drove innovation during the First Contact Wars, and ethical concerns were set aside in the desperate scramble for survival. Pete asked what happened to those scientists, and Carl said most of them had been reassigned to other projects after the war. A few had stayed to maintain the facility until the super soldiers were placed in stasis, then disappeared into history. The prototype warships were brought online one by one. The Requiem emerged from its bay first, its dark hull gleaming under the facility lights. Lin piloted it herself on a test flight, pushing the ship through maneuvers that would have torn apart conventional vessels. The ship responded to her enhanced reflexes perfectly, turning and accelerating with precision that seemed impossible. Danny took the Dirge out next, testing its weapon systems against automated targets. The results were devastating. the ship's plasma cannons vaporizing practice drones in single shots. The aftermath was slower to come online due to power system issues, but Marie worked around the clock to fix it. Jake stood on the Valiant's bridge and watched the super soldiers train through the observation ports. His crew was exhausted, running on stimulants and sheer determination, but these ancient warriors seemed tireless. He wondered if that was part of their enhancement, or if they were simply better at hiding their fatigue. Sophie joined him at the window and voiced the question he'd been avoiding. She asked if they could trust these soldiers, if warriors designed to be superior to normal humans could truly fight for people they barely understood. Jake didn't have a good answer. He wanted to trust Lynn and her soldiers, needed to believe they were on the same side, but doubt gnawed at him. That doubt was tested when one of the super soldiers, a man named Greg Palmer, suffered a sensory overload episode during a training drill. He collapsed in the middle of the exercise, his enhanced nervous system overwhelmed by conflicting input. The other soldiers moved to help him immediately, carrying him to the medical bay with careful efficiency. Jake followed and watched as Lynn administered treatment, injecting Greg with a compound that calmed his enhanced reflexes. She explained that overload episodes were rare but dangerous, and all super soldiers carried emergency medication. Greg would be fine in a few hours, but it was a reminder that their enhancements came with vulnerabilities. Danny found Jake later that day in the facility's observation deck. The soldier stood quietly for a moment before speaking, saying he understood Jake's concerns. The super soldiers were different, changed in ways that made them seem alien to baseline humans. But those changes hadn't erased their humanity, just buried it deeper. They still felt loyalty, still understood duty, and they still cared about protecting innocent lives. The emotional dampening made those feelings harder to express, but they existed. Danny asked Jake to judge them by their actions, not their differences, and Jake agreed to do that. The first mission came together quickly. Lynn identified a Krath supply depot in what used to be human space, a facility that supported enemy patrol fleets. It was lightly defended, perfect for a hit-and-run strike. The plan was simple. Danny would lead 30 super soldiers in a fast assault, destroy the depot's supplies and communication arrays, then withdraw before reinforcements arrived. The Requiem and Dirge would provide fire support and extraction. Jake wanted to send some of his crew along, but Lynn refused. This first strike needed to be fast and brutal, a demonstration of what the super soldiers could do. Normal humans would only slow them down. Jake watched from the Valiant as the two warships departed, accompanied by several assault shuttles carrying Danny's strike team. The journey to the target took 6 hours, and Jake spent that time reviewing the facility's old tactical database. He found files on the First Contact Wars and read about battles where outnumbered super soldiers had torn through enemy formations. The reports were clinical and detailed, but between the lines he could see the horror of what those warriors had been designed to do. They weren't just soldiers, they were living weapons, and the enemy they faced now would learn that the hard way. The strike began in the early morning cycle of the depot's local time. Danny's team breached the facility's outer defenses using cutting tools that sliced through Krath hull, plating like paper. They moved through the corridors in perfect formation, each soldier covering their assigned sector with military precision. The Krath guards responded with confusion rather than organized defense. They had never faced enemies that could move so fast, that could coordinate without verbal communication, that could survive hits from energy weapons that should have been fatal. The battle was over in 12 minutes. Sophie monitored the mission from her tactical station, relaying real-time data to Jake. She reported that Danny's team had destroyed the depot's main supplies and communication systems exactly as planned. 3 super soldiers had been injured, but none critically. They were withdrawing to the extraction point now. Then her voice changed, became urgent. Krath reinforcements were arriving faster than expected, 6 warships jumping in from nearby patrol routes. The Requiem and Dirge were engaging them, but the enemy had numbers on their side. Lynn's voice came through the comm system, calm and controlled. She ordered the Valiant to stay out of the fight, saying her ships could handle it. Jake watched the battle unfold on his tactical display and felt helpless. The 2 prototype warships moved through the Krath formation like dancers, too fast to target effectively. Their weapons tore into enemy shields with devastating power, but the Krath weren't helpless either. Their ships were larger, more heavily armed, and they had the advantage of numbers. One of the assault shuttles took a direct hit and exploded, killing everyone aboard. 4 super soldiers gone in an instant. Jake saw Lynn's ship absorb several hits, its advanced armor holding but weakening. Danny's team made it to the dirge and were picked up, but now both ships were surrounded. Then the Requiem did something impossible. It accelerated directly toward 3 Krath warships, firing everything it had. The enemy vessels tried to evade, but Lynn anticipated their movements and cut them off. Her ship slammed into the lead warship with its shields at maximum, the impact tearing both vessels apart. Jake shouted into the comm, but there was no response. The explosion cleared, and he saw the Requiem limp away from the wreckage, heavily damaged but still functional. The remaining Krath ships broke off their attack and retreated. They had expected an easy fight and found something they couldn't comprehend. Humans who fought like demons and refused to die. The Requiem barely made it back to the facility. Its hull was breached in a dozen places. Systems were failing throughout the ship, and casualty reports showed 7 super soldiers dead and 12 more injured. Lynn walked off her ship under her own power despite having burns across her arms and a deep cut along her ribs. She reported mission success to Jake, her voice steady despite her injuries. The depot was destroyed. The Krath had been bloodied, and they had proven that humanity could still fight. The cost had been 11 lives, but the message had been delivered. Jake helped carry the wounded to the medical bay while Sophie coordinated damage control on the Requiem. Pete and his team worked to repair the ship's critical systems, amazed that it had survived such punishment. The super soldiers tended to their injured with quiet efficiency, and Jake noticed they held a brief ceremony for the fallen. No speeches, no elaborate ritual, just a moment of silence while their names were added to a memorial wall. These warriors mourned differently than baseline humans, but they mourned nonetheless. Danny found Jake in the command center hours later and told him the mission had provided valuable intelligence. The weeks following the depot raid transformed the facility into something between a military base and a refugee center. The captured Krath communication equipment allowed Sophie to broadcast coded messages into former human space, signals that only humans would recognize. She used old military protocols and civilian emergency frequencies, sending out coordinates and safe passage instructions. The response was slow at first, just a handful of ships limping toward Sanctuary 9. But each arrival brought more survivors, people who had been hiding in asteroid fields and abandoned stations, waiting for a miracle that finally came. Jake found himself overwhelmed by the influx of refugees. Most were civilians with no military training, families who had fled the Krath invasion with whatever ships they could steal or salvage. They arrived expecting to find a functioning human fleet and were shocked to discover ancient super soldiers and a dying warship. Some were grateful just to be alive, while others were terrified of Lynn's warriors. Jake spent hours mediating between frightened refugees and frustrated super soldiers who didn't understand why anyone would fear them. The cultural gap between people from different eras created constant tension. Lynn observed the growing refugee population with tactical calculation. She told Jake that every person who arrived was a potential asset, someone who could contribute to the war effort in some way. The civilians needed organization, training, and purpose. She assigned several super soldiers to work with Jake's crew on creating a proper command structure. Danny took charge of security. Carl and Marie handled technical training, and Lynn herself worked on strategic planning. The facility was never designed to hold this many people, but they made it work through efficiency and discipline. Among the new arrivals was a young man named Troy Bennett, who caught Lynn's attention during a routine security screening. He had been a civilian transport pilot before the invasion, flying cargo between colonies. His ship was barely functional when he arrived at Sanctuary 9, held together by improvised repairs and desperate hope. But his piloting scores were exceptional, and Lynn saw potential there. She began training him personally, teaching him aggressive combat maneuvers that civilian pilots never learned. Troy absorbed the lessons with natural talent, and within days he was flying patterns that impressed even the super soldiers. Sophie worked tirelessly to coordinate the growing resistance. She set up a communication network that connected scattered survivor groups across several sectors, creating a web of information exchange. Through these channels, they learned that humanity wasn't as extinct as they had feared. Thousands of people had survived the invasion, hidden in places the Krath considered too worthless to search thoroughly. But they were scattered, isolated, and without leadership. The broadcasts from Sanctuary 9 gave them hope and direction, something to rally around. The resistance was taking shape, one refugee at a time. Pete found himself teaching baseline humans about technology they could barely understand. The facility had manufacturing capabilities that could produce weapons, armor, and ship components, but operating that equipment required training. He worked with civilian engineers and mechanics, showing them how to use systems that seemed like magic compared to standard technology. Some of his students learned quickly, others struggled, but everyone tried. They understood that every weapon produced, every ship repaired, every piece of armor fabricated brought them one step closer to fighting back against the Krath. The super soldiers struggled with the influx of baseline humans in ways Jake hadn't anticipated. Their emotional dampening made it difficult for them to understand the fear and trauma the refugees carried. When civilians recoiled from them or whispered about how unnatural they looked, the soldiers didn't feel hurt in the traditional sense, but they recognized they were being rejected. Danny explained it to Jake late one night in the observation deck. The super soldiers had always known they were different, but during the first contact wars they had been heroes. Now they were relics from a forgotten age, frightening reminders of what humanity had been willing to do to survive. Jake organized a meeting between the refugee leaders and Lynn's command staff. The civilians needed to understand who the super soldiers were and what they were fighting for. Lynn addressed the crowd with her typical directness, explaining Project Lazarus and the First Contact Wars. She didn't sugarcoat the truth about what had been done to her and her soldiers, the genetic modifications that made them superior, but also isolated them from normal society. She told them about being imprisoned in cryostasis because politicians feared what they represented. And she told them that none of that mattered now, because the only thing that mattered was survival. The Krath wanted to erase humanity from existence, and the super soldiers would die before letting that happen. The speech had mixed results. Some refugees found comfort in knowing these powerful warriors were on their side. Others remained suspicious, arguing that soldiers designed to be superior might eventually decide they didn't need to protect inferior humans. Jake defended Lynn's soldiers, pointing out that they had already bled and died fighting for people they barely knew. Actions mattered more than fears, and the super soldiers had proven their commitment. The meeting ended without full resolution, but at least people were talking instead of just avoiding each other. The next mission came together as intelligence reports revealed a Krath command post coordinating patrol fleets in 3 sectors. Lynn wanted to hit it hard, not just to disrupt their operations but to capture more intelligence. This time Jake insisted on sending some of his crew along with the strike team. His people needed combat experience, and the super soldiers needed to learn how to work with baseline humans under fire. Lynn agreed reluctantly, assigning Troy to fly one of the assault shuttles and taking Sophie along as a tactical advisor. Jake would remain at the facility to coordinate the overall operation. The strike force departed with 60 super soldiers, Troy's shuttle, and the Dirge as fire support. The Requiem was still being repaired from the depot raid, too damaged to risk in combat. Jake watched them disappear into the darkness of space and felt anxiety gnaw at his stomach. Sophie was out there now, his second in command, someone he had worked alongside for years. If something went wrong, if the Krath were more prepared this time, he could lose her. But war required sacrifice, and everyone who volunteered for the mission understood the risks. The approach to the command post was tense. Long-range sensors showed heavier defenses than expected, including automated weapon platforms and patrol ships on regular circuits. Lynn adjusted the plan on the fly, splitting her forces into 3 groups. Danny would lead a team to disable the weapon platforms, another group would board the command post itself, and Lynn would coordinate from the Dirge while keeping enemy ships occupied. Troy's shuttle carried Sophie and a technical team whose job was to hack the command post's systems and download as much data as possible. Everything had to happen simultaneously, or the Krath would lock down their systems and destroy the intelligence they came for. The battle began with the Dirge launching a missile barrage at the patrol ships, drawing their attention away from the command post. Danny's team moved through vacuum using zero-gravity assault packs, hitting the weapon platforms with magnetic charges. The explosions created confusion, and the main strike force breached the command post's hull during the chaos. Sophie's shuttle slipped through the defensive perimeter and docked with a secondary airlock, Everything was going according to plan until the Krath sprung their trap. Enemy reinforcements arrived without warning, jumping in from multiple directions. 6 warships and a dozen assault craft surrounded the command post, cutting off retreat routes. Jake watched from the tactical display and felt his blood run cold. The Krath had been expecting them, had set up the command post as bait. Someone started shouting orders through the comm channel. Then Lynn's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. She ordered all teams to complete their objectives while the Dirge engaged the enemy fleet. There would be no abort, no retreat until the mission was complete. They would either succeed or die trying. Sophie's team fought their way through the command post corridors against Krath soldiers who seemed better prepared than the depot guards. These were elite troops, trained and equipped for close combat. The super soldiers with her took point, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to dodge energy fire that would have killed baseline humans. But even they couldn't avoid everything, and casualties mounted. Sophie reached the central computer core and began the download process, her fingers flying across alien interfaces while plasma bolts scorched the air around her. The data was massive. Terabytes of tactical information, fleet movements, supply routes, everything. She needed 5 minutes to complete the transfer. 5 minutes they might not have. Danny's team finished destroying the weapon platforms and regrouped to help the main strike force. They found heavy resistance inside the command post, Krath warriors fighting with desperate fury. The battle devolved into brutal room-to-room combat, super soldiers using their enhanced strength and speed against enemies who had numbers on their side. Danny led from the front, his movements a blur of violence and precision. He saw 3. The preparation for the Sol assault consumed every resource and person at Sanctuary 9. Lynn knew they needed more than just ships and soldiers for this mission. They needed hope. She ordered Sophie to broadcast their intentions across all channels, coded and open alike, telling every human survivor in the galaxy what they were about to attempt. The response was overwhelming. Ships began arriving daily. Everything from barely functional freighters to military vessels that had somehow survived the invasion. Within 2 weeks, the resistance fleet had grown to 15 ships, none of them in perfect condition, but all of them ready to fight. Jake watched the fleet assemble with mixed emotions. Every ship that arrived brought more people willing to die for a chance at revenge, but also more lives he felt responsible for protecting. The Valiant had been repaired with technology from the facility and was now more capable than it had ever been, but it was still just one ship. The Requiem and Dirge were operational again after marathon repair sessions, and the aftermath had finally been completed. But against the forces defending Sol, their fleet was hopelessly outnumbered. Lynn insisted that numbers weren't everything, that strategy and surprise could overcome raw firepower. Jake wanted to believe her. Troy spent every waking hour training with the super soldiers, learning their aggressive tactics and pushing his skills beyond what he thought possible. Lynn worked with him personally, recognizing that his natural talent could be refined into something exceptional. She taught him to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate enemy reactions, to fly like his ship was an extension of his body. The other civilian pilots watched Troy's transformation and pushed themselves harder, not wanting to be left behind. Within days, the Resistance had a squadron of pilots who flew with a confidence they never possessed before. Danny organized the ground assault teams, mixing super soldiers with volunteers from the refugee population. Many of the volunteers had no military training, but they had rage and determination. He taught them basic combat techniques, showed them how to work with the enhanced soldiers, and drilled them until exhaustion forced them to stop. Some washed out, unable to handle the intensity, but most persevered. They understood this was their chance to strike back at the species that had tried to exterminate them. Every person who qualified for the assault teams felt like they had earned the right to be there. Sophie coordinated the intelligence operation, analyzing every piece of data about the Sol command station. The facility orbited where Mars used to be, a massive construct protected by defensive platforms and a fleet of 30 Krath warships. The station controlled operations across 6 sectors and housed the regional commander, a Krath war leader named Throck who had orchestrated the final assault on Earth. Getting to him would require penetrating layers of defenses that seemed impossible. But Sophie found weaknesses, small gaps in patrol patterns and blind spots in sensor coverage that could be exploited. It would require perfect timing and coordination, but it was possible. Pete worked with Carl and Marie to arm every ship in the fleet with the best weapons available. The manufacturing systems at Sanctuary 9 ran constantly, producing missiles, plasma cannons, and armor plating. They couldn't outfit the civilian ships to military standards, but they could give them enough firepower to be dangerous. Pete also designed boarding equipment that would allow assault teams to cut through Krath hull plating quickly. Every advantage mattered in a battle where they would be outnumbered 3-1 at minimum. The night before the assault, Jake called a meeting of all ship captains and team leaders. The facility's main hangar was packed with people, soldiers and civilians standing shoulder to shoulder. Jake spoke about why they were fighting, about the homes they had lost and the people they had buried. He reminded them that humanity had been declared extinct, that the Krath celebrated their victory over a supposedly inferior species. Tomorrow they would prove that humanity was still alive, still dangerous and unwilling to go quietly into the darkness. When he finished, the hangar erupted in cheers that echoed off the metal walls. Lynn addressed her super soldiers separately, gathering them in the training bay. She spoke about duty and sacrifice, about the purpose they were created to fulfill. 600 years ago they had saved humanity from extinction, and tomorrow they would do it again. Many of them would die in the assault. That was the nature of war. But their deaths would matter, would inspire others to keep fighting, would prove that humanity deserved to survive. The soldiers listened in silence, and when Lynn finished, they simply nodded. Words weren't necessary between warriors who understood the cost of their calling. The fleet departed Sanctuary 9 in the early morning cycle, 15 ships jumping to hyperspace in synchronized formation. The journey to Sol took 6 hours, and Jake spent that time going over the plan repeatedly. The Requiem, Dirge, and Aftermath would lead the assault, using their superior speed and firepower to punch through the outer defenses. The Valiant and 3 other military vessels would target the defensive platforms, clearing a path for the civilian ships to approach. Once the fleet engaged the Krath warships, assault shuttles would breach the command station and fight their way to Throck's command center. It was a straightforward plan that relied on execution rather than cleverness. They emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system and were immediately detected. Krath warships moved to intercept while defensive platforms powered up their weapons. Lynn gave the order to attack, and the resistance fleet charged forward like a spear aimed at the enemy's heart. The Requiem opened fire first, its plasma cannons tearing through the shields of a Krath cruiser. The Dirge and Aftermath flanked it, spreading their fire across multiple targets. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back now. Jake commanded the Valiant with Sophie at his side, coordinating attacks on the defensive platforms. Their enhanced weapons proved effective, destroying 2 platforms in the first minute of combat. But the Krath responded with overwhelming firepower, concentrating their fleet on the attacking ships. One of the civilian vessels, a converted freighter named Hope's End, took direct hits to its reactor and exploded with all hands. Jake felt the loss like a physical blow but couldn't afford to dwell on it. He ordered the fleet to maintain formation and continue pressing forward. Troy piloted his assault shuttle with a skill that impressed even Danny, who rode along as mission commander. They dodged anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, weaving through the chaos of battle toward the command station. 8 other shuttles followed in tight formation, each one carrying 20 soldiers and volunteers. The station's point defense systems opened fire, creating a wall of energy that seemed impossible to penetrate. Troy found a gap in the coverage and dove through it, his shuttle taking minor hits but staying intact. 2 other shuttles weren't as lucky, exploding before they could reach the station. The remaining 6 pressed on. The boarding teams cut through the station's hull and poured into its corridors. Danny led the way with 30 super soldiers forming the vanguard, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to clear rooms faster than Krath defenders could react. The volunteers followed behind, fighting with determination that made up for their lack of training. They encountered heavy resistance immediately, Krath warriors in powered armor that took concentrated fire to bring down. The battle became a brutal grind, every corridor contested, every room paid for in blood. Sophie coordinated the overall battle from the Valiant's bridge, tracking fleet movements and directing fire where it was needed most. She watched as another civilian ship, the Defiant Star, rammed a Krath warship in a suicide attack that took both vessels out of the fight. The resistance fleet was being torn apart, losing ships faster than they could destroy the enemy, but they were creating enough chaos for the assault teams to penetrate deeper into the station. Sometimes victory required sacrifice on a scale that was hard to accept. Lynn piloted the Requiem in a dance of death with 3 Krath warships, her skills allowing her to survive against overwhelming odds. She destroyed 1 enemy vessel and damaged another before her shields finally failed. Energy weapons tore through the Requiem's hull, causing massive damage throughout the ship. Lynn ordered her crew to evacuate while she kept fighting, using her dying ship to cover their escape. Jake watched the tactical display and shouted for Lynn to get out, but she didn't respond. The Requiem rammed the nearest Krath warship at full speed, both vessels exploding in a fireball that lit up the battle space. Danny fought through the command station like a force of nature, his enhanced strength allowing him to tear through obstacles that would stop normal humans. He lost soldiers with every corridor they advanced, the casualty count climbing steadily. Troy and the remaining volunteers fought beside the super soldiers, proving that baseline humans could stand against impossible odds when pushed hard enough. They reached the command center after 40 minutes of continuous combat, finding it defended by Throck himself and his elite guard. The war leader was massive even by Krath standards, over 3 meters tall and covered in battle scars. He wielded weapons designed to destroy armored vehicles and fought with a ferocity that matched the super soldiers. Danny engaged him directly while his soldiers